Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We are going to get started in just a minute or so. We've got a number of people still joining us. Thanks to those of you who are joining us today. We're just going to give it a few more seconds. We've got a lot of folks signing in. All right. Well, let's get started. Welcome to today's webinar, Understanding Non-Operating Landowners, Opportunities for Farmland Stewardship and Succession Planning in Virginia and Beyond. Today we'll be discussing who non-operating landowners are, how they make decisions about their farmland, and ways to engage with them to improve conservation outcomes on rented lands. My name is Jamie Mira, the Mid-Atlantic Regional Director for American Farmland Trust. Also joining me today is Gabrielle Roche McNally, AFT's Women for the Land Initiative Director. For those of you not familiar with American Farmland Trust, I'll do a very quick introduction. American Farmland Trust is a national nonprofit membership organization founded in 1980. We work to save the land that sustains us by protecting farmland, promoting sound farming practices, and keeping farmers on the land. Some know us best by our No Farms, No Food bumper sticker. We work on projects ranging from farmland protection to soil health initiatives to land access strategies for next generation farmers and ranchers to state and federal policy development and advocacy. We have 6 regional offices, including the Mid-Atlantic, and our national office is located in Washington, D.C. Before we get started, I'll run through some logistics to help make this a good experience. Everyone has been muted, so no need to do that yourself. If you would like to ask a question or make a comment, which we hope you will, you can do so by going to the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. The orange arrow at the top of the panel allows the panel to shrink and reopen. You'll see a question section on the control panel. You can pop that section out by clicking on the little square, and you can type your questions and comments in there, and we'll leave plenty of time for Q&A after the presentation. We are recording this webinar, and we'll send the link to the recording to everyone who registered, and we hope that you will help us share this recording with others who you think may be interested. At this time, I'm excited to be able to turn the floor over to Gabrielle, who will walk us through today's presentation.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jamie. And it's nice to be here virtually with all of you. Again, we're all getting very skilled and adept at navigating our virtual worlds. Again, thank you for joining our session here today. I think we'll have plenty of time for some discussion at the end of my presentation. And I have one poll that we'll be using just to kind of gauge your perspectives on some things. So I'll get going. So just as a reminder, we're going to be sharing some results that are really relevant to this non-operating landowner survey that we did in Virginia, but it's tied to a multi-state survey that we did now in 13 states, and I'll dig into that a little bit more. That just gives you a sense that there'll be some points where I'm going to talk kind of about Virginia in particular, and then I'll be talking a little bit more broadly about what we can understand and learn from Knowles more broadly from this survey effort that we've gone through. So Jamie already gave you a great background on American Farmland Trust. So just as a reminder of who we are and what we're about, we're so glad, that we've hopefully got some new folks and folks who are familiar with our programming. But why did we do this work in Knowles? Perhaps some folks wonder how this ties to our mission, but what we know about the landscape is how important these sort of non-operating landowners are when we think about the landscape of farmland in the United States. So this map here is the percent of land in rented farms or land that's leased from the 2017 Ag Census. And you can see that there are counties in the United States where we have 60%, and it's up to 80% in some counties, where we have that land that is rented out. And a lot of that land that's rented out is owned by these non-operating landowners who have little to no engagement with their land. Depends on kind of a number of factors as to how engaged they are with the management decisions that happen on that land. But we know how important these folks are. So we sought to kind of learn more about this important demographic. We wanted to kind of understand who are these folks that own about 40% of the land, in total, 40% of the US land. And again, as I said, depending on the county, it's much higher. We wanted to understand them. We wanted to understand their decision-making processes. We wanted to think about what are barriers to conservation on the land they own and think about ways to overcome that. And ultimately to use this research guide recommendations on how to better improve conservation on rented lands. Perhaps many of us have heard that, rented land is really tough to get conservation practices on. Maybe we've heard things like landlords only care about their financial bottom line. We've heard things like we can't talk to the landowners, so we have to work with the farmers who don't talk to the landowners. So all that to say that, there's lots of stories about what's happening. We wanted to try to ground truth that a little bit better, since really the only national data set is our land tenure survey that the National Ag Statistics Survey conducts. The last one they did was in 2014, and it's not a national scale survey. People refer to it as the total survey. That's really only the national data we have that engages with this kind of audience. So we sought to kind of fill in some of the gaps. So we had a total of almost 4,000 respondents in our total response for all the surveys. You can see that this map, I haven't updated it with our Pennsylvania and Virginia maps fully colored in, because when I created it, the results were still coming in, but we have all the results now. So in Virginia, our final sample size was 138, so was smaller than some of our other states. We struggled this summer with the administration of this survey because of the pandemic. So, as we talk through the results, we'll want to sort of couch those carefully in terms of, how much does it say about other non-operating landowners in Virginia? But one of the sort of reassuring things about the data is we have this large, not fully national data set, but we have many states involved. And what we've seen is a real kind of saturation in social science. We use that term saturation when the data start to sort of look really similar. So what we find is that across the different states, there's a lot of similar responses of Knowles. So it helps us to sort of track that there are themes that seem to be validated across different states. So there's some differences, but there's also some themes that we think are pretty generalizable to Knowles based on the data that we have. We did try to get a really clear gender split. This land is not owned 50-50 by men and women, but we know that women Knowles are a really important audience, and I'll chat a little bit more about that later. And so we want to make sure that we were sampling to get women landowners as well as their male counterparts. And really what I'll be presenting for you all today is kind of just descriptive statistics that you can find in our reports and drawing some synergies between the two different reports, both the multi-state and then the state level report. So I wanted to kind of start us off around the key recommendations for working with non-operating landowners. And I'm going to share kind of what comes from the full report and then ground it to what kind of arose out of the state level findings. And again, what's nice is there's some harmonization of these results, which help us see that there's a lot of good kind of synergy happening between what we're learning about Knowles as a broader population. So one of the things, again, I'll dig into each of these a little bit more fully. So we found that we have a need to cultivate greater awareness among Knowles of government conservation programs. We need to amplify their willingness to support their operators or their farmers with conservation practices. There's a need to emphasize succession planning or thinking about who is taking over the farm when Knowles move on or pass away. And then we know based on this work and some other research that we've done, there's an importance to reach out to both women and men Knowles, and sometimes in different ways, to improve outcomes on rented lands. And then finally, this piece is around kind of cultivating a greater opportunity to strengthen ties to farming, to land, and the community where their land lies. And again, I'll tell you more about each of these pieces. So in Virginia, I wouldn't say the results differ. Our recommendations don't drastically differ, but we did certainly find that there were high levels of trust in the farm operator and a willingness to make changes to the lease to allow the implementation of conservation practices. Landowners were, again, willing to sort of be experimental and change things up to support their farmers in experimenting with conservation practices. And there is a clear desire by landowners to keep land in farming for future family generations. So what do we know about landowners in Virginia based on our survey? So they're older. That's probably not going to come as a huge surprise, and that's true across the board in all the surveys we did. About almost half of them have experience with farming, which is higher than some of our other states. And that'll come into some other kind of recommendations that I'll talk about in a bit. But often it's good news when they have kind of some of that experience with farming. It ties them more directly to the land. But over half of them are not resident on their land, and their median distance is around 40 miles, but that can be kind of, a broad swath of, a mid, median, and max sort of range. But it's not too terribly far away. So we kind of make some presumptions that it's good news if they're not living too far away, they might actually be more engaged with the land. So what about the land? So, kind of maybe a little smaller compared to some of other states in terms of the median amount of acres that folks own. They rent out, over half of that. Most of the production is in crops. Again, that number is a little less than some of our other states. So maybe a little more diversified operations. They've definitely owned the land for decades, and they're planning on keeping that land in the family. So their relationship with farmers, we really explored this deeply in our surveys. So what kind of relationship do they have with the farmer who rents their land? So this sort of nearly 70%, they lease to family, friends, or neighbors. That's very common across the country. It's largely through a verbal agreement. That's a bit higher than in some of our states, like New York and California, but in the Midwest, verbal agreements are absolutely very common. So it's sort of within the span there. We'll talk a little bit more about maybe some of the challenges of a verbal agreement. These leases, though, are long-standing. They're annual terms, but they've been going on every year for a long time. And overwhelmingly, they trust their farmer operator to make good decisions and make conservation decisions for the land. So, to my point sort of around recommendations, there is this great support for changes in the lease to benefit both parties and conservation goals. So if you look at these, certainly high levels of trust. Folks have high levels of, comfort asking their operator to use certain conservation practices. Still over 50% who are willing to include lease provisions that would require farmers to implement practices that would sort of mitigate soil erosion, these kinds of things. So again, a great level of willingness to sort of engage in a more formal way to facilitate conservation. But one of the things that we found both in Virginia, and again, these tables are for Virginia results, compared to all the other states, this was a very common theme, was a sort of kind of a deep trust in their farm operator lessee, and trust in information, looking at some government resources. But then when you ask them how interested they are in interventions around having access to educational materials or leasing tools, it's a fairly small percentage. It still would be great to reach that percentage of folks, but we see that there's I think, and we'll talk more about this maybe in the Q&A, but there can be sort of this tension between sort of not having the information to know that they might want the information. So we've been kind of trying to explore what's driving kind of this willingness to support conservation, but a lack of interest in resources dedicated for their use. So again, well, we can dig more into that if folks are interested. So there is this deep support for the symbolic importance of the land. So, you know, these are factors that folks consider when making management decisions. And, you know, they obviously need an income from the land. So that's 79% of respondents. But that wasn't the number one need, right? So soil, water quality, keeping the land in farming. These are values that folks have for the land that they own that are part of their decision-making processes. And I think this table surprises some folks when sometimes the sort of narrative is that the needing for income from the land is the number one reason why folks are holding on to that land. And actually, well, this is good news, at least based on our survey sample size, is that 11% don't have a clear next owner of the land identified. In many of our states, that number was quite a bit higher, up to 20% or more don't have a clear next owner of the land. So this is kind of tied to whether or not folks are planning, making succession plans, making plans for who's taking over that land. My guess would be if we had a bigger sample size, we might see that that is a higher number, but it would be fun to dig into a little bit more about maybe what's happening in Virginia because that number is lower than in other states. So again, but still points to this need of kind of engaging in dialogue around thinking about who's going to take that land over, especially as we see how much older our landowners are. Again, the majority see a value in preserving their land. And this table is actually based on aggregate research from all of the survey, so from 13 states where we surveyed. So some of these analyses we haven't done for just each of the states, but we kind of look at, you know, they see this value in preserving the land. And what we found is that if they've directly operated a farm or helped to operate a farm, sometimes they are a little bit more likely to help make management decisions around certain things like soil quality, keeping the land in farming. So, but as well as sort of need for income. But what we were trying to do there is just sort of see like there's this value in preserving the land, but we're also kind of as people are more tied directly to that recent management of the land, they may be more likely than those with no farming experience. So, and again, I'll kind of reiterate that in one of my recommendations. So before I drill into the next slide, which is around barriers, I want to launch just one poll for you all. And it's sort of barriers on rented land. So I just love to hear from the audience here today what you think the biggest barriers are on rented lands based from your experience, your reading, your own research. So we'll just give it a little bit of time for folks to respond. It's always a fun one because everyone's got usually a good diversity of perspectives here. We've still got some folks voting, so we'll give it just a little bit more time. You all are you're diligent voters. We want to count every last vote. So we'll just wait just a little bit longer and I'll end the poll. All right, I'm going to go ahead. It's not everybody, but I think we'll end it there. So if I share the results with you, you can see what it actually is pretty diverse here. So Knowles just don't know about conservation practices, and I'd definitely say that ties to some of the results I was just sharing with you. And then some of these perspectives around incentives don't work well for Knowles. That'd be an interesting one to talk more about. And yeah, this sort of dialogue between farmers, won't talk to their landlords about it. Landowners only care about their bottom line, and then other. If folks want to use the chat box to add in any details to that, I welcome you to do that. So we wanted to ask the landlords or the landowners what barriers they identified to conservation practices. So if we look here, what we found, and it's very true across all the surveys. So again, I'd say our saturation is quite good in terms of kind of what are these barriers that people were identifying. And what was fairly clear is that there aren't like highly sort of powerful limiting factors. So in terms of a significant limiting factor, only 25% of folks said a weak farm economy was sort of their a significant limiting factor to their engaging in conservation. The too many requirements associated with government programs, not a high number, although some of the other questions show that some of our Knowles maybe aren't as aware of government programs. So I don't know how well informed that response is, but this is based on their perceptions, right? So for those indicating that's a significant limiting factor, these are not highly significant limiting factors. And then again, not at all limiting factor, folks felt like there weren't concerns that conservation would decrease their value of their land, and they weren't worried about disapproval from their neighbors. So some other research on conservation practice adoption should suggest that folks are concerned if they adopt conservation practices like cover crops, their fields might look messy, their neighbors might not like it. But what's nice to see this, our Knowles are not worried about that, and perhaps because they live greater distances away from the land, they're less kind of concerned about what's happening there. But again, what this highlights is it tracks really well with the other states that we surveyed, and that there weren't sort of like glaring limiting factors that folks identified, which I think is a real opportunity. So when we kind of just kind of pull out a little bit beyond Virginia, I wanted to kind of just share about some other results that track to what we saw in Virginia, but we did some analyses that are kind of more broad. So we see this need to reach out to women and men Knowles and to improve outcomes, but we want to kind of think about the importance of maybe reaching out to men and women a little bit differently. And I know we have some Women for the Land Learning Circle participants in our audience today. So again, I'll talk a little bit more about some of the ways we've tried to reach out to women Knowles specifically. And then we need to the point of sort of that experience with farming, how important that is to sort of driving some of their decisions and greater support for conservation. We've kind of found that there's a need to engage Knowles more to create opportunities to sort of strengthen their ties to farming, the land, and their community. So men and women Knowles, they really have similar views. We did a gender kind of analyses to see if there were differences. Some of the literature suggests that there are different perspectives on conservation and environmental kind of attitudes between men and women in the United States. We want to kind of assess those things, and what we found, there are some differences between them, not always significant, statistically significant. You see that column on our right around significance. Again, not all of these, we didn't see significant differences across all of these, but what we did see is this deep trust for, especially even more so for women, for their operator, and this sort of continued goal to keep working with the same renter, and even a little bit more flexibility in terms of kind of modifying their lease and whatnot. And so they're, a little bit more support for these things. Again, when we look at the rates, they're very similar. And I think when we look at some of our analysis, we found that women tend to have a little less experience with direct management or decision-making on the farm. And because of that, I think that is actually some of that like lack of experience perhaps is leading to sort of greater trust and reliance on their farmer operator. But again, there's a lot of nuance there. We can drill into that if folks are interested. But I think the great news here is a lot of similarities and but certainly some differences as well. So But I would just say kind of more broadly is something that, as the Women for the Land Initiative director, which I haven't talked a lot about here, we think a lot about kind of some of these gender dynamics. And so some of the things that we looked at more deeply in terms of the findings from this set of surveys was that these women are much less likely to have experience as the farm operator. And we did find that that has impacts on some of their decision making. They're 2 times as likely to indicate they did not know what practices were being utilized on their land. Again, 21% of them didn't know if their land had been enrolled in cost share programs or if a conservation plan had been developed for the land. So we found some of these these are kind of some of the differences that seemed more apparent in this kind of gendered analysis we did. But certainly we recognize a need to reach out to both men and women Knowles. But there might be some different strategies that we can use. And we found that because women have sometimes less experience with traditional kind of farming decision making, we're not sort of brought into the tractor with their dad or their grandpa to work the farm in the same way that men often have experiences of. Also found that women still feel quite uncomfortable or not welcome in kind of mainstream agricultural spaces where they might go buy a tractor or buy cover crop seeds, these kinds of things. So for that reason, one of the things that we've done with Women for the Land and American Farmland Trust is to do some direct outreach. So again, I know Jamie shared with me some of the folks in our audience today have participated in our Women for the Land learning circles. So again, I'm not spending a lot of time talking about that here, but just to say we have found some real success in reaching out to women Knowles, and increasingly we're reaching women farmers and women new and beginning farmers. So we don't just talk with these non-operating landowners, but we have found them to be a really important audience. And we engage in these peer-to-peer discussions, bringing in conservation and kind of technical resource providers to help bring information to women that they may be unfamiliar with, and often tie that when we can be in person, interactive demonstrations, farm tours, discussions around relevant topics like soil health or water quality or pollinator habitat, and lots of other topics. And just really facilitating this dialogue. And we found a lot of success in empowering women Knowles and other women in agriculture to be more engaged in decision making on their farms. So I'll leave that there. Folks are welcome to ask more questions on that topic. But kind of this last point is really around the importance of engaging Knowles to cultivate this, again, this greater community and kind of ties to the land. And so one of the analyses we did that we found was even more interesting in some ways than the gendered analysis was to kind of look at that history of having helped operate a farm, directly operating a farm, or having no experience. And so we found things like, participating in cost share programs. If someone's directly operated a farm, they certainly have a lot more experience than those with no farming experience. Those who have received technical assistance. Again, we found that it was interesting that people, the more ties to direct management, the more familiar they were with programming, and that tied to some of their interest in driving conservation as well. So while we can't necessarily fix people's historic experiences, we're making the recommendation there's a need to kind of cultivate more of these ties, connect people back to the land, either their own land or agriculture in general, which fits really squarely in the mission of American Farmland Trust. So I'm coming in here on the end of my slides. Just a couple more things to sort of just highlight, right? So again, the main pieces that I wanted to highlight here with Virginia was, again, our results in Virginia tracked really well with the national results, which I think is great. It shows that we have developed some level of saturation, the data coming in from all 13 states that tell us something about non-operating landowners. Not everything, it's a highly, I think, diverse group of people, and we could always use more information. But what we do understand is a great deal more support for conservation practices and formally integrating conservation into things like leases. There are high levels of trust for farm operators. There might be a way to sort of facilitate greater engagement and dialogue in that space. And then we see across the board in Virginia and more broadly, there is a real desire to keep farmland in farming and preserving that for future family generations. So again, I think that ties to things that we care about at as well as keeping land in farming and how to sort of facilitate that. Virginia was great news that at least among the people we surveyed, we saw a larger number of them who already had plans in place for who was going to take over the land. And that continues to be such an important conversation to facilitate or to support people finding clarity about what are the plans for their land when they're no longer the owner or they're no longer the manager. So with that, I'm going to end my talking at you portion. Just as a reminder, you can get, we have our Farmland Information Center, and we've got a whole special collections page with all of our state reports. You can find our Virginia fact sheet. You can learn a little bit more about Women for the Land, but lots of good stuff. I was only able to cover kind of the high level pieces from our report. But with that, I'll hand it back to Jamie to kind of help talk us through some of your all's questions.
Great, thank you so much, Gabrielle. Just a reminder, if you have questions or comments, please send them to us either through the questions box or chat. Gabrielle, for some reason, I don't have access to the questions that are being asked through that section or function. But we do have a number of questions coming in through chat. So hopefully we can maybe get to both. One of the questions is around the idea of corporate ownership versus family ownership, and kind of to what degree we're seeing corporate ownership versus family ownership in Virginia, and how does that affect the conservation perspective?
That's a great question, and actually something I did not share in the beginning. So one of the ways that we kind of sampled for this this audience was to focus on kind of individual landowners, folks who basically don't own land in trust. So that can be, and that can kind of lead to more corporate land ownership structures. So what we looked at here was sort of that maybe more, I don't know if it's traditional is maybe not quite the right terminology here, but sort of thinking of these sort of in the literature and the way that NAS looks at it is sort of these like individuals who own land but who rent it out, but that land is maybe, owned in partnership with like a couple or an individual who has sort of inherited that land. Some of the more complicated ownership structures that we know are on the landscape around sort of trusts that are multiple families or more corporate land ownership structures we didn't survey for. So it is an important point to make that I think our findings are really relevant to that sort of more traditional Knowles audience, and can't tell us as much about some of these land ownership structures. Certainly some of the research that I have seen, not for Virginia in particular, but for the nation as a whole, that I think there are more kind of structural challenges to conservation on corporate lands. That being said, sometimes it's complicated because some large scale kind of corporate landowners are actually able to implement kind of on a larger scale things like no-till or cover crops on all their acreage in a way that actually folks who have maybe more different types of land holdings that aren't all in one place, that actually can be those kind of like more geographical barriers. So anyways, this is you could teach a whole college seminar on this topic. Suffice to say, it's complicated, and it would be important to note that our results really kind of get at this at these Knowles owners. And I think the corporate land ownership is complex. Certainly you can see a lot of these like large scale supply chain leaders who are driving kind of conversations around regenerative agriculture and getting either farmers in their supply chains. So you still have farmers who are growing for PepsiCo and Cargill and General Mills, driving them to adopt more conservation practices. So, but we did not survey those corporate entities to kind of gauge their interests. But I'd say it's a complex but interesting topic.
Great, thank you, Gabrielle. Can you speak to whether the survey analyzed lease relationships that involve leases of farmland to women, to farmers of color, or other underserved farmers?
That's a great question, and is an area just that I know AFT we're talking a lot more about kind of increasing access of land to a more diverse group of people. Our survey did not get into that, and really there, yeah, we launch into these kind of survey efforts. You always kind of look back and go, we should have done some things. So, and there were some things about, you know, kind of land ownership demographics that we didn't capture. So we don't have good information on our respondents around their sort of race and ethnicity. We do have gender information, but I think that would have been important to collect, and it did not happen, unfortunately. And in terms of kind of lease arrangements, kind of that next generation, we didn't collect that information, but I think it would be such a neat kind of next stage of some of this kind of research.
Great. Do you have any advice for working with non-operating landowners who expressed interest in leasing land, but ultimately have maybe some unrealistic ideas of what that could look like? Whether that's things like high rent or just not really willing to tolerate the realities of farming with noise and smells and other kind of issues.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And, you know, I would say that at AFT, we launched a kind of project this summer in Illinois, so not here in Virginia, perhaps in the future, really kind of trying to facilitate a little bit more of a dialogue between landowners and renters. And I think that's, to me, kind of the next stage for folks, you know, in the audience who are doing this work is thinking about how can we better facilitate dialogue between these, I'll just say audiences, these groups that are connected to one another. But, and we see there's high levels of, say, trust in a farm operator, but I'm not always sure that there's a great sort of conversation or dialogue happening between a landowner and a renter or about some of these topics. I think potentially because some of the presumptions are that, you know, landowners aren't going to support me in this, so they don't care about that. And I would say our results suggest that a great deal of these Knowles do care about conservation and are willing to engage in dialogue. So how can we kind of help facilitate or support those conversations happening? So I don't have like a super direct answer to your question, but only that I think there's an opportunity to increase those kinds of conversations. And I'll just, like, I can show just to that point, maybe one slide that, you know, that I've been thinking about. So we've kind of been thinking more about how to kind of facilitate these discussions. And one of the topics here is like getting folks to think about co-investing in soil health as something that benefits both the longevity and future productivity of a land, that also helps someone's productivity in the year-to-year basis. So it has a benefit to farmers and landowners if they can see it that way. And so we have some soil health case studies that folks might be interested that kind of prove that point around some of production and financial benefits of investing in soil health. And then this sort of need to kind of engaging everyone who's involved in the decision making on a land to kind of think about investing and co-investing in soil health. And again, you know, to our point in our findings, we found many verbal and many year-to-year leases. And some of the advice here is to think about writing longer term leases and writing leases versus verbal arrangements, so that you have a more formal arrangement that can facilitate that kind of agreement and kind of illustrates to both parties that we're both going to bear some risk associated with doing something differently. Yeah, I always, you know, I think with these questions, there's always like a desire for a silver bullet. I don't think that there is one, but I keep using this term because I love it. It's like the silver buckshot approach, but that there's going to be a few different strategies we have to take to kind of facilitate these kinds of conversations.
Great. We also have some questions around finding and connecting with non-operating landowners. What kind of thoughts or recommendations do you have in terms of outreach to non-operating landowners, and how did you find the folks that participated in this survey?
Yeah, that is probably one of our most popular questions. And I would say that it's, again, always going to be an interesting challenge as people more disconnected from the land. Our traditional methods of reaching out to folks through extension or those soil and water districts, conservation districts, or federal partners can be trickier. We actually purchased landowner information based on tax records from a private firm. There's a lot of these who do that. So, and often for survey work, that is what's done, unless you can partner with someone like NAF and the USDA, but that's pretty tricky to do. And they are not often are not going to share individual information about landowners. They're very protective of that for good reason. And so we had to purchase our information. I will say that, with our broader outreach, we've really taken a lot of different tacks. So certainly going to the folks, you can get some landowner information from your local conservation districts, working with key partners who have ties in a region, a watershed, a county. We've also found really kind of getting creative about the kinds of outreach we do in terms of, do we put articles in local papers? Do we put signs up at, when we used to go to get our hair cut or go to the cafe? Maybe you all still doing that in Virginia. We're not in Oregon right now, but we're, thinking about, getting people where they go in their everyday, especially because Knowles aren't necessarily going to the farm supply store at the same rate. So getting creative about what are those like community level spaces where you can do outreach. And we've actually done quite well in reaching women Knowles that way. And then conducting what we call like snowball sampling, where you kind of get folks to share information based on their friends or neighbors who might be interested in the information as well. Sometimes you can get this information from farmers themselves, but again, there can be a hesitancy to share information about their landowner. Or this is probably less true in Virginia, but in some states, a farmer might have multiple landowners that they work for and may, be kind of protective of that information. I don't know if that's the same in Virginia, because I think, that's more prevalent in the Midwest. So yeah, I think, being creative in terms of, but I don't think there's, it's a good place to start sometimes in purchasing records that can help you kind of get a sense of what's out there, and then kind of using a multi-pronged approach to reaching out to these folks.
Great. We have another question around incentives, whether there are incentives that can be offered for things like conservation easements.
Yeah, I think, that actually would be, I think, a broader question than like specifically, for Knowles. There's good programs, obviously. I don't know, Phil, who's asking, there's good incentives offered either at the state level or from the federal level. So from both NRCS in particular, in terms of providing some more from the kind of conservation practice and land kind of set aside programs. And then I don't know about state level incentives. I don't know, Jamie, you might actually have an answer to that question in terms of for specific to easements in Virginia. I don't know, actually. I know that NRCS has some national scale programs you can find information out about at your county. But I don't know if there are other, because every state usually has some incentives around both conservation practice utilization, but sometimes for agricultural easements as well. So I know, Jamie, you might have a perspective on that.
Yeah, well, funny you ask. We just hosted a conservation learning circle just last week, and our partners, the Piedmont Environmental Council, joined us and did talk about the variety of state and federal conservation easements that are available. And I'm happy to share resources with folks on the call about that, and also to connect you with the Piedmont Environmental Council, who's actually joining us today. So they'll be a great resource for you. So in the same vein, thinking about the survey results from earlier, there were quite a few folks that that voted for the incentives that don't work well for Knowles. And I was hoping you could maybe give some thought or context or, thinking around what what that might mean and why incentives may not work for Knowles.
Yeah, so I think, I added that. I've been doing these presentations now for different states, and I had a slightly different framing, but I've been thinking more about that question because so a lot of my research, I didn't say this in the beginning introducing myself, but I'm a sociologist by training, and a lot of my research has been around farmers and their adoption of conservation and climate resilient practices. And so from that frame, we really found often this sort of tension between some of the requirements associated with conservation and folks feeling like sometimes those requirements are too onerous. And obviously lots of folks navigate those resources well, but it can be a stumbling block for folks to feel like, oh, there's just too much red tape, I don't want to engage. So, breaking down barriers to help facilitate people's kind of ability to apply for, loans, to sign up for EQIP, these kinds of programs, to facilitate that and support them. And that is always a good goal. I think when I was posing that question in the poll, what I was really thinking about was the fact that really a lot of the focus of a lot of the programs kind of has that, even if folks are landowners, but they're managing their land directly. And there's a lot of kind of framing and narrative around kind of those who are actively managing their land. And so to this point that we've found that Knowles kind of tend to be harder to pin down. Where are they? How are they getting information? Do they want information? That question we asked, not a lot of them were that interested in information directly designed for them. But just because they don't want that information, in my mind, doesn't mean that it might not be valuable, because I think a lot of the way that these programs are set up is set up for folks who are engaged in direct management. And so I think I'm more posing the question of, like, if we see that as a barrier, what are some strategies, folks working in this space could think about helping facilitate connections to programs for Knowles that meet them where they're at, which, again, to that other finding where, we found that those who have experienced farming, they have been more likely to use certain kinds of conservation programs. And so the more distant someone gets, both from their physical land, but also from the experience of farming or that background, the harder it may be to connect them to those resources. So we may have to then develop resources that work for them. And actually, to that point, I'll share another slide that was in my extra slides. But we have Farmland. And so this page is sort of like a little bit more framed around kind of connecting landowners to their farmer tenants. But we have a landowner focused page on the Farmland Information Center, which is trying to sort of get at that, like, we recognize this is a unique demographic, and that the information they want is different than a farmer might want to look at. And so you can kind of check out this farmlandinfo.org /landowners page. Another kind of one that you could look at is the TNC just put together a nice website as well. And it's facilitates that dialogue with farmers and landowners, but it's designed for landowners. And so that's one of the things that we see some of our conservation orgs doing more, is designing things for the landowner in mind. And so I'd say, as a long-winded way of saying, that if we're going to design incentive programs to meet farmers, we may need to design incentive programs, or at least the entree to them, with Knowles in mind. So there might be some tweaking that could be done in those spaces. That was a roundabout way of getting to that answer. But I did want to share some of these resources with folks, because you might find some of those conversations well. And then I just say that for women Knowles, we've also found that it's important to engage them with different resources a little bit as well, kind of meeting them where they're at and creating materials where they can see themselves. So, creating images of more women in agriculture and women who might look like them or have experiences like them. And that's certainly one of our learning circle experiences, is that women often feel very isolated in this space and find it very empowering to meet other women who are experiencing the same thing. So I guess all that to say that I think we've got to meet Knowles where they're at and develop a little bit more focused programming, incentives, resources that are for them, not just presume they're going to use the same resources that are available for farmers.
Thank you, Gabrielle. So those are the questions that have been posed via the chat. If you have other questions that you see, Gabrielle, please go ahead and address those.
Yeah, I actually think that was disabled for this call, but that's okay. So it looks like people figured out to use the chat. So the only thing I saw was something about AFT's position on nutrient baking. And to be honest, I don't have an answer for that. I don't know, Jamie, if you have any information or if we're involved in nutrient baking much. I don't know. I don't know that. I don't think I could speak to AFT's position on it or any work we're doing in this space, but Jamie, I'll just, if you do, I'll offer that to you.
You know, I'm not able to answer that now, but we'll follow up in my email after after the webinar today and let you know what that is.
I do see. Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just saying, the only other things are people were just asking kind of about next steps if we're going to send the recording. And so I know the plan is to send a recording of this presentation. We can send the slides as well. And I think based on some of these questions, Jamie will make sure we can provide some additional resources that, you know, emerged of interest so that we can connect people to some of the resources we mentioned here today.
Absolutely. Yes, we will do that. Wonderful. So Gabrielle, do you have any final words that you'd like to share?
You know, I think the only thing I just appreciate everyone's time and, you know, appreciate the sort of one-way delivery of information can be tricky, but I appreciate what great questions. And the only piece I would just say that is kind of my soapbox these days is to really challenge this notion that landowners and these Knowles are not partners in the conservation efforts that many of us are involved in. That I think that narrative has been told, and I think sure there are places where perhaps landowners are only worried about the bottom line, but our results don't bear that out. We show that there's a deep desire to steward the land for current and future generations. There's a desire to facilitate greater risk sharing between landowners and their farmers, to facilitate, you know, creative conservation solutions. So I just like people, I hope people leave these presentations feeling hopeful, because I think it has made me more hopeful about the potential to facilitate conservation on rented lands. Yes, it'll be complicated and there will be challenges, but I think there's a lot more opportunity and a willingness among landowners to be partners in this in ways that I don't think we really as a conservation community have given enough weight to in the past. So I appreciate everyone's time.
Thank you, Gabrielle, and thank you everyone for joining us today. As Gabrielle mentioned, I will follow up with links to the summary of the results from the survey we discussed today, as well as a recording of the webinar. Again, please share with others who may be interested. And if there are other questions that have been posed in the final moments here, we will answer those directly also. So thank you very much, and we look forward to being in touch soon.